Welcome back to our second session on apologetics. And in this one, having laid a foundation of understanding an overview of apologetics, what I want to do is look at some key apologetics issues. Now, before I get into the specific issues that we want to talk a little bit about today, a couple of thoughts on this. It's important to keep apologetics contemporary. Most of the issues are the same. They've always been the same. The questions, the big questions like the existence of God and the person of Jesus and the Bible and so forth. But the way they're framed really does change from generation to generation. Each generation is interested in different kinds of questions. There's a lot of things that today's generation is asking that nobody was really asking when I was young. And vice versa, some things that people were asking back in the day that really not asking today. And so we don't want to end up answering questions that nobody's really asking. And so you want to listen and you want to pay attention to the culture and to the individual people you're talking to try to keep apologetics contemporary. And I'm going to try to do that the best I can, even though I've been around for a few years. So I want to talk about 7 specific issues that apologetics addresses. The first one is the existence of God. This is the starting point because kind of everything comes from this. And there are a number of classic arguments that have been made to establish or defend the idea that God exists. I'm going to talk about 4 of them in this session. First one is the argument from causation. And that addresses the question of why is there something instead of nothing? Why does anything at all exist? And the fact that things do exist, where did it come from? Where is the beginning? Is there a beginning? And how can we conceive of the existence of something if there isn't a cause or a source or some reason for the universe to actually exist? So everything that we know in this world is contingent. The word contingent, that's the philosopher's word for it means that it's dependent on something else for its existence. That it has, in other words, it has a cause. And so the universe has to be dependent on some cause outside of itself. And classically, theologians and philosophers have argued that there has to be some kind of uncaused cause at the beginning of the chain of causation. Now, David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, tried to deny the idea of causation. He said that just because we see every time you drop an object, it falls to the ground, that doesn't mean there's a cause involved in that. It could just be coincidence. But common sense dictates that we know that when we do certain things result, or that when we see something that it had a reason why. And so we're asking, what's the reason why for the existence of everything that does exist? Why is there something instead of nothing? Well, there must be a primary cause, a first cause, an uncaused cause, and we would call that God. And then another argument for the existence of God is the argument from design. We look at something and we see that it has the earmarks of having been designed. There's order, there's complexity, things that kind of show that there must be some kind of mind behind what we observe. And so, for example, the old argument back in the 18th or 19th century was the clockmaker argument. If you were walking along a pathway in the woods and you saw a pocket watch on the ground and just in no context, there it is on the pathway next to a tree stump, you pick it up, you would look at it, you would say, oh, this must have been made by somebody because it has an obvious design, it has an obvious function. And so the argument from design suggests we look at the world around us and things work. We look at molecular biology. We look at the larger universe and say, hey, this appears to have some kind of design. We see a garden, there we figure there must be a gardener. And one way to talk about this is what is called the anthropic principle. And you look at the world we live in and the universe we live in, you see that for life to occur, there are a number of things that have to line up just right, just perfectly. It's such a narrow group of conditions for life to even exist, for human life to exist. the fundamental constants of physics have to all have the values that in a very narrow range. Okay, so gravity, for everything else, that they have to work the way they do, it's very much contrary to the idea that it could happen by chance. So gravity, I mentioned, the speed of light has a certain constant. The nuclear forces inside the atom, they all line up with perfection for life to work, for human life to work in particular. And if any of them was a little bit off, then our existence would not be possible. And so you can't prove that that can't happen by chance, but it's highly improbable. In fact, just from common sense again, if you're playing cards with somebody and they win all the time, 100% or 99% of the time they win, then you have to start thinking about, hey, maybe they're cheating at cards. The probability is so high. I mean, it's a possibility that they weren't. It's a possibility they're just winning and they have good luck. But when it happens over and over again, it happens in so many instances, then the probability is so high that they're cheating to be virtually certain. And the same thing with the design and the all of the things that have to add up for life to exist. Yeah, it's possible that could have all happened by chance, but the probability of it happening by chance is so low that it is virtually it's virtually certain that it could not have happened by chance. So it must have had a designer or a creator behind the world that we live in. A third argument for the existence of God that you'll often hear is the argument from moral obligation, or sometimes this is called the argument from natural law. In other words, the question is, why do people act as if some things are actually right and wrong, that are objectively right and wrong, that there's some sense that, no, that is wrong and it's always wrong, and that's right and it's always right. See, when it comes down to daily life, nobody is ever a consistent moral relativist. We've always got this sense that, hey, it's wrong to kill people. And pick your vice. It's wrong to whatever it might be. Well, where does that sense that things are right or wrong come from if there's no external source of truth or reality outside of ourselves? We all have a sense that beyond our own individual conscience, there are standards that exist outside of ourselves. In fact, that's the basis of law. That's the basis of civilization, that we're not just completely defining truth and right or wrong just in terms of my own preferences or my own conscience. That would be complete chaos. But people then live as if there's an outside moral lawgiver, or there's someone outside of ourselves who creates moral obligation. And so, without an outside source, we have no basis for judging that other cultures are wrong. So this is the inherent contradiction for the atheist point of view, that our modern secularists will say the oppression of women is wrong. Well, in our culture, there's other cultures that are patriarchal. There's other cultures that practice different practices toward the role of women that are oppressive. But what basis do we have of saying that other culture is wrong if morality is simply relative? How can we appeal to some larger source to say, well, that's wrong, what that culture is doing is wrong, and what we do is right, that justice is right, that compassion is right? There's no basis. Every culture has taboos against killing. Every culture around the world, you go everywhere you look, has taboos against sexual misconduct. Now, they're not always the same, but there's some core issue that every culture in the world says that, no, that's wrong. It's wrong to kill in at least some certain circumstances. It's wrong to act out sexually, at least in some certain ways. Why is that the case? Why is it universal? And why are there certain things that are always earmarked unless there's some objective source of moral obligation or natural law outside of ourselves? So that source would be God. And then a fourth, now there's more arguments than these four, but these are four that I see come up from more often, and I think that are more compelling and that are also maybe less philosophically complex. But then there's the argument from aesthetics. And for me, this one is powerful to me. Why do we care about beauty? Why do we recognize beauty? Why do we think that some things are beautiful? Why do we stop to appreciate a sunset? If we're just evolutionary beings, why would a sunset convey any kind of evolutionary survival advantage, to any kind of a creature? If we are accidental, then beauty is simply biochemical. And that means that art and natural beauty, whether you see beauty in art, whether you hear it in music, whether you see it in nature, a waterfall or whatever else impresses you, then all of that's just an illusion. And so what is the source of goodness, I guess? What's the source of aesthetics, that sense of beauty? And you say, well, if that can't arise evolutionarily, it can't arise just from within ourselves, there must be some external source. Now, none of these arguments are conclusive. Again, you can't prove that there is an ultimate cause that was not caused. You can't prove that the world didn't come together by accident. You can't prove any of these things in the sense that people regard proof today, but they are very suggestive, and when you're taken cumulatively, they do suggest that the belief in God is at least reasonable, that it's not foolish and it's not anti-intellectual to believe in God. Now, one of the things that we understand when we look at this, we realize that these arguments don't tell us much about what kind of God he is. They don't tell us about a triune God. They don't tell us about even a personal God. But this is the starting point in our apologetics, is the fact that God exists. So we can make some arguments that cumulatively suggest the reasonableness of a belief in God. And then the next issue that we have to respond to in people call into question the credibility of Christianity has to do with the character of God. See, so let's say posit there is a God. Then what kind of God is that God? Is that God a loving God? Is that God a just God? Or is that God a kind of being that would be impossible to give one's allegiance to? And so looking at the character of God, there's three things, three issues that often come up. The first one is, how could a good God allow suffering? So is God not good, or is God not omnipotent? So the argument has been framed like this. So God can either be good or he can be powerful, all powerful, but he can't be both. Because if God was all good and all powerful, then he would stop evil from happening and stop suffering from happening in the world. So the question of suffering, the question of evil. And so God must be good and he hates evil, but he's not powerful enough to do anything about it. Or God is all powerful and he could stop evil, but he's not good, and that's why he doesn't do anything about it. And so now that's the way that it's been framed, but the question, it's a problem that is a problem for everybody. The problem of suffering, the problem of evil, is also a problem for atheists. It's a problem for everybody, not just people who believe in God. Because even atheists don't have a very good reason to understand, why is there evil in the world? Where does that come from? And why do we even think in categories of evil and good, of what's just and what isn't just? And so the fallacy behind this argument is the assumption that suffering is meaningless, or that suffering is always bad. That's based on our reckoning, and a very short-sighted and very temporal view of suffering is that it's always bad. But what if that's not the case? What if suffering has a redemptive purpose? What if suffering really can contribute to good in the universe? And also, when you think about it, atheists have no good basis for being outraged at evil. Because that would assume an objective external standard of right and wrong. So how can the atheist say that injustice is bad, that we should be outraged at the presence of injustice or the presence of evil in the world, and God ought to do something about that, when to posit evil or injustice in the world in those absolute sense says that there must be some kind of objective standard outside of ourselves. And if there isn't, if there's no God who's setting that standard, then it's simply absurd to talk about the problem of evil in the world. Now, one of the things that Christians would say in response to suffering is not only does it have purpose, we would also say that at some point God is going to correct all evil in the world. He just doesn't do it right now because he wants time to give people time to get right with him. And so when you think about evil and you personalize it, you say all of us have committed evil. If God was to wipe out all evil in the world at midnight tonight, who of us would still be around at 12:01? None of us would. Or if you think about the worst possible cases of evil in the world, you think of serial killers and you think of genocidal dictators and so forth, and you've got like Stalin here or Jeffrey Dahmer, and you move it a little bit, and you move it a little bit more, so you find a character who's not quite as bad as them, or you find another character who's not quite as bad, and pretty soon that line moves over here to here's where I am. At what point in that scale do you say, well, I'm going to destroy everything over here, but not everything over here? So it's really an incremental thing that if God was going to deal with evil the way that we expect him to, then he would have to deal with our evil as well. And God says, I actually am going to do that someday. There's a day of reckoning where people will answer. So how could a good God allow evil and suffering? Well, he doesn't ultimately allow it at all. And then the other thing that the Bible points out that's unique to Christianity is it shows that God suffers with his people, that God makes suffering redemptive, that Jesus entered the world and he became one of us, a human being, and that actually he suffered injustice and he suffered deprivation, he suffered hunger and thirst, he suffered physically, and in all of the ways that evil in the world works were all poured out on him. So God enters into this suffering with us. And so those are some thoughts on how could a good God allow suffering. It's more complex than just saying, oh, God must not be good or God must not be powerful. Now here's another one that people will ask. How can a loving God send people to hell? Well, without Christianity, first of all, the idea of a loving God doesn't even exist in the first place. And so, again, this is a question that's kind of piggybacking on an assumption of Christian reality, that the Christian church has and scriptures have taught us that God is a loving God. That would not be an assumption that we make without our revealed knowledge of him. So how could a loving God send people to hell? There's a few things to think about in regard to this. Now, another one is that if love is real, if God really is a loving God, then love always has a protective element. That if I love my child, then I'm going to defend my child against evil. Okay, I'm going to do something to protect and defend my child against a possible threat to their safety. If I didn't do that that protective action, then I wouldn't really be a loving father, would I? And so real love hates evil, and it hates evil for what it does. And so really all loving persons are sometimes filled with wrath. If you're not, then you're not loving, you're just apathetic. And so God is going to act against evil. God is going to act ultimately to quarantine all evil in the universe because of his love for his creation, for his people. And another thing to think about here is that hell, when you think about the idea of hell, that it's really nothing more than the continuity of a person's own attitudes and wishes in this life. In a sense, God doesn't send people to hell. There's a sense in which hell is each person's freely chosen identity. If you choose that you don't want anything to do with God, you say, hey, I want nothing to do with God, then why would God disrespect that choice in eternity and say, well, you said you didn't want anything to do with me, but I'm going to make you spend eternity with me. So God honors the choices that people make. When we shake our fist in God's face, say, I want to be away from you. I don't want to have anything you to do with in my life. God says, okay. Sorrowfully, God says, then, I will allow you to have that autonomous direction on into infinity. The trajectory of your choices then become eternal. And so this whole idea about a loving God sending people to hell there's some nuance to that, and there's some answers to that. It's challenging because we don't like to think of any human person suffering infinitely, and yet there's some reasons why that makes sense in the light of the universe. If God's a just God, if God hates evil, then there must be some kind of a just consequence for people's choices in this world. Now, a third issue related to the character of God has to do with, would a just God require the genocide of pagan peoples? Okay, this refers to the command of God in the Old Testament, where He says to His people that they're to completely destroy the Canaanites or the Amalekites or the city of Jericho. There's several instances where God says the whole city of Jericho, completely destroy every living person. And so how are we to think about that? Is God just some kind of an evil genocidal dictator where He just wipes out whole peoples? Well, this is an argument that has gained, I think, traction over the last generation. Thinking about, I think, the way people think about people, other people groups, and with more cultural and more sense of awareness of other cultures and more tolerance of other things. That this, I think, has gained traction. But there are some thoughts on this. For me, this is not an easy one. But there are some thoughts. And one thing is that the Canaanites were an incredibly depraved and sinful people. The Canaanites practiced child sacrifice. They were. We don't, I think, grasp or appreciate the depths of the depravity of that culture when we say, sometimes we frame it in terms of why would God allow innocent people to be destroyed? Well, they weren't innocent in that sense. Now, God's highest priority was to preserve the Messianic line so He could bring a Savior into the world. And so to do that, to preserve that lineage so that the whole world could have a Savior, then God had to protect the quality and character of His people from these incredibly sinful surrounding nations. And so another thing to consider was that because of how depraved they were, that God's judgment was really a lawful execution. It wasn't just an arbitrary wiping out. It wasn't just like what the winning army does to the losing people that they subjugated. But God's judgment was a lawful execution that they deserved as a people. Now, one of the things is that we don't understand is this idea of corporate responsibility. Because in our culture, our Western culture, we are very individualistic. But in the Bible, in the ancient Near East, and in other cultures around the world, Asian cultures and so forth around the world today, there's much more of a sense that people are corporately responsible. They make decisions together, that there's this sense of corporate connection that binds a people, that binds a community together, so that what one person does really is what the whole group does. And that has to be kept in mind. Now, we also see that there's a pattern in Scripture with respect to these annihilation commands that God does this to stamp out a cancer, basically. That judgments are for a public recognition of extreme sin. And so it's not just a matter of protecting His people, but also warning others against falling into those same kind of activities. There's this preventative medicine, so to speak. But it's always preceded by warning. God always says that, if you don't turn, then this is what's going to happen. If you don't repent, so nobody's caught unaware. Nobody then is completely without consequence because they were warned. And then if there are people who do respond to God, so-called innocent adults, even though nobody's fully innocent, but they're always given a way of escape. An example of that is Rahab in Jericho, that she had heard about God and God's fame, and she wanted to align herself with this God, and so God spared her life. Nobody else in the whole city of Jericho apparently was willing to change allegiances. Well, it raises the question, what about children? And again, because children, are children really tainted by the culture? Children really morally responsible for the sins of the culture and so forth? Well, there was always a period of warning to families And so that, again, people could have changed their attitude and changed their allegiance. But the fact is that, again, there's this corporate mentality that we don't understand in our individualistic culture today. And also the fact that entire culture is corrupted by the sins of the adults. And so, biblically, the fate of children has always rested with parents. There's always a connection. Parents are responsible for their actions, but their actions affect their children as well. And so, in God's larger global economy, there's this bigger picture taking place. And so those are some thoughts. Again, this is not an easy one for me, but I think those are some thoughts that might help us in the right direction. And there are other resources I'll share with you in a minute that can give more insight into some of these issues. Now, eventually, we come to questions about Jesus, about who Jesus is and his claims. And so 3 things here. Number 1 is his claim of deity. And so Jesus claimed to be God, or at least his followers certainly claimed that he was God. And there's good evidence in the New Testament that Jesus himself made those claims. So what was his identity, his sense of self-identity? He claimed to be one with God, and he expressed that a number of different times in a number of different ways. And so looking at those claims, the historic way that this has been framed is to think about the claims of Jesus and to think about what kind of teacher was he. Making these claims of oneness with God, was he then a liar? Was he actually knew that he wasn't, but he was deceiving people? Well, that doesn't seem consistent with what else we read about him in the primary sources, in the eyewitness accounts. We read about him as being compassionate, and everything else that he said rung true, and people were pierced by the truth of what Jesus said and the authority of what he said. So was he a liar? That would not make sense. Was he a lunatic? Was he crazy? Just says like, oh, I'm God. There's all kinds of people today who claim to be Jesus or Napoleon or something like that. And so was Jesus a lunatic by making those claims? Well, again, you look at his life, his character, his interactions with people, his lucidity and clarity on every other issue. It doesn't make sense to say that he was a lunatic. Now, traditionally, we've said liar or lunatic or Lord. If he wasn't a liar or a lunatic, then his claims must be credible. But there's another factor in here. You have to ask, was Jesus just a legend? Were his claims not really his claims, but were they claims raised by his followers and put into his mouth, so to speak, to advance this new religion that they had founded? And there's too much evidence from the early church and from the scripture and the history of that time to suggest that Jesus was just an invention of his followers. That wouldn't make sense either. In light of the times that he lived in. And that'll you'll go into that in another segment when we talk more about the Bible and the reliability of the Bible. And so when you think about Jesus' claims of deity, if you think about it logically, there's no way to test those claims objectively in a scientific sense. We can't go back and do repeatable experiments. And so we have to test it in a historical sense. Historical evidence and scientific evidence are 2 different things. Historical evidence is the kind of evidence that's used in a court of law. So you have witnesses, you have forensic evidence, you have circumstantial evidence usually, and you can bring people into court and say, what did you see? And then bring people into court and say, what is the logical implications? Does it add up? Does it tell a narrative that makes sense? Because a crime committed or something that's evaluated in a court is not a repeatable event. And so those are the same kind of standards of evidence that apply when we're analyzing any kind of historical situation. And that would be the case when we look at Jesus' claims. That's also the case when we look at the resurrection. Nobody took a picture of it. It's not on video. Nobody who was there is still there. And so we have to analyze the narrative and analyze what the eyewitnesses said, analyze the logic of the different claims that were made, and whether they make sense or not, to evaluate whether there is a reasonable claim that Jesus really was raised from the dead. And so, for example, there's the matter of the empty tomb. Where was the body? And all that people had to do, if the Jewish religious leaders, the Roman leaders, if they wanted to squelch this new movement that was out there proclaiming the risen Jesus, all they had to do was go to the tomb where Jesus was laid and produce the body. And Christianity would have been over forever within days. But the fact is that, apparently there was no tomb where the body lay. And so what do you do with the empty tomb? And where was the body? Just put it on a cart and parade it through the streets of Jerusalem, and the whole thing is over. And then there are the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. There's a number of people that claim that they saw him. And it wasn't just a mass psychosis. There were individual events, Jesus walking along the road to Emmaus with some followers, and Jesus appearing in the upper room when people actually touched his resurrection body. And so we have these actual eyewitness accounts that have to be taken into account, just as they would be in a court of law. And then there was a powerful change in the lives of the disciples. When Jesus, after he died, they were cowards. They were hiding out in the upper room. They didn't want to be arrested and tried themselves. They thought that maybe their lives were hanging in the balance. But that was on Saturday. But by Sunday, by the day after the resurrection, Monday and Tuesday, they were bold. They were out there, spreading the word. They were out there facing the prospect of mockery and of actual even physical persecution, of being flogged for this message that Jesus was alive. Now, a lot of people can be very convinced about something that's not true, and they could be zealously in favor of it. But for this to happen, we would have to posit that the disciples knew it was a lie. Okay, nobody dies for what they know to be a lie. Nobody faces persecution and actual threat to their bodily life and safety for something that they know is a lie. They will capitulate. If there's a conspiracy and people are in on it together trying to sell this thing to the community, when things get tough, at least one of them is going to break. At least one of them is going to speak and tell the truth. Well, that never happened in the early church. So the disciples were changed people, and they're willing to face death. They're willing to go out boldly. How could you account for those changes if Jesus did not rise from the dead? And then another one is just the very origin of the Christian faith. Where did it come from? How did this just happen overnight? In a place that, in Jerusalem of all places, there were faiths arising throughout the ancient world, but in Jerusalem of all places where the monotheistic Jews had this long heritage of faith, and in that context, this new thing arises that actually, why did it grab hold? Why did it take root if it was based on just some kind of falsehood? It just happened overnight. It wasn't just a long-term development. So those are things that have to be accounted for when considering the resurrection. And the reason, at least coming to the point where we can say the resurrection was a reasonable answer or explanation for the actual situation. And other claims that have been made, none of them really bear weight. They don't really make sense that Jesus just swooned on the cross. He didn't really die, and he was revived in the cool of the tomb. And, then he came outside looking like he'd just been crucified. And how would that inspire people to think that he rose from the dead? And so there's a lot of great evidence to suggest that the resurrection is a credible claim. And then the exclusivity of Jesus as Savior. How can he say that he is the only way to God? That's covered in a different module, in the module on contemporary issues. And so I don't really feel like I need to cover it right now. And then apologetics addresses the question of sources of authority. So who is really telling us the truth? How do we really know what's true or what to believe? And so under this comes the question of the reliability of the Bible. Is the Bible a reliable authority upon which to base our lives and base our beliefs? And again, this is covered also in the contemporary issues module, I believe, and so I'm not going to really go into it here. But this is a crucial question: is why do we believe the Bible? And we have a number of reasons to show through archaeology and history, through the Bible's impact, through its internal consistency. There's a number of reasons to believe that the Bible is reliable and it can be trusted when it speaks. Now, another related one has to do with faith versus science. Now, this is about authority because ultimately, is science our final authority for what we believe is true? Is science where we're going to get all of our worldview assumptions from? And I'm not going to go into this today either because that's covered actually in another module in the course, and so it's covered with all the depth and the time that it takes to do that. And so I just wanted to raise those so that you're aware of them, but I'm not going to really go into them now. But then another apologetics issue that comes up often has to do with the church. The nature of the church, of God's people. And one of those questions that's raised or criticism that's raised that cuts against, in some people's minds, the credibility of Christianity has to do with historic injustices perpetrated by God's people. And so what about like slavery before the Civil War? It was advocated by theologians, by Christians, and it was seen as, biblical. And there are other examples like the medieval church and its stance against science and Galileo and its attempts to try to obfuscate the growing scientific knowledge of the world. So the church has blown it many, many, many times in history, has really gotten off course many, many times in history. But is that a compelling argument against the Christian faith? Well, on the other side of the coin, you have to understand that Christianity also has a tremendous track record of justice, because Christians were also the driving force behind the abolition of slavery, not just in America, but in England. It was Christians, because of their conscience and their desire to be obedient to the Word of God, that said slavery should be abolished. Christians were the driving force behind the civil rights movement, the Reverend Martin Luther King and others. He was a pastor. It was pastors and Christians in churches that impelled the civil rights movement in America forward. Christians have been behind the opposition to communism wherever it has raised its head, and totalitarianism wherever it's raised its head around the world. Christians were the ones who took a stand against Nazism. Dietrich Bonhoeffer involved in resistance to the Nazi regime and others. Now, unfortunately, all Christians have not taken this stand. All Christians, and sometimes Christians in general, have not been on the side of justice. But there always has been some who have, because they've taken seriously what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. And then sometimes people will point to character flaws in Christians. That, there's a flawed leader. There's a Christian leader who fell into adultery or some kind of other problem. And so those character flaws in Christians and Christian leaders lead some people to believe that Christianity cannot be credible. But when you think about it, the very nature of the Christian message assumes the flawed nature of its members. The whole point of the gospel is to offer hope to flawed people. And if Christianity is true, then it appeals to flawed people. It is an invitation to flawed people. It isn't about creating perfect people, but there's going to be plenty of people in the life of the church who are broken, because that's the kind of people that Jesus offers hope to. And so that we take that into account. Now, certainly Christianity should be changing the character of its people. But we would never assume that, given the basis of the gospel, that Christians would be perfect. And then another charge that's often leveled against the church that apologetics answers is the charge of fanaticism. That Christians can be hateful, that Christians can be overbearing, that they're too politically active, that they really are a negative force, a negative voice in society. But the kind of Christians that people typically object to, who are rude and self-righteous and overbearing and harsh, that's not because they're too Christian, it's because they're not Christian enough. And so you see that people say, oh, we're going to reject Christianity because these people are too Christian. No, if people were more Christian, then Christianity would be more favorable. These people are not Christian enough. They don't live up to the things that they profess. And so that's not a problem with Christianity. That's a problem with people, the people who profess it. So hopefully that gives you just an overview of some of the issues. And then, of course, there are some specialized issues that kind of maybe are particular to different groups that are making different religious claims, have their own apologetics issues. For example, Jehovah's Witnesses, they will argue that Jesus is not God. So that's an apologetics claim. They'll argue that certain core issues that Christianity has traditionally espoused are false. They'll argue against the authority of the Bible and so forth. So there's particular claims that overlap, but some that are unique. And then same thing with Mormons or Latter-day Saints. They have their own religious claims that they're making, and they have claims about the Bible, for example. They have claims about the authority to speak for God. They make a claim that the Christian church fell into apostasy and had to be restored. And so that's a claim that apologetics can answer. Was the Christian church apostate? No, never in the sense that Mormonism describes. And so each group has its own issues, its own claims that have to be considered. Now I want to show you a couple of resources that can help you. This is a bibliography list that's really worth investing in some of these sources. The Reason for God by Timothy Keller. It's pretty up to date. It's very sensitive to the postmodern context because Keller, ministering in Manhattan, is surrounded by the postmodern culture, the secular culture. It's compassionate. It answers objections on one hand, but it also goes on to make a positive case for the Christian faith. It's pretty philosophically sophisticated, but it's also accessible to intelligent Christians. And then Keller has written another one more recently called Making Sense of God. He has the same approach as The Reason for God, but this one is addressed directly to the skeptic. And so Keller argues from contemporary secular sources. He argues from their own philosophers, their own poets, in ways that challenge the claims of secularism. And he presents a very appealing view of Jesus as being the answer to human needs. So it's a very winsome example of what all of apologetics can and should be. Now, a little bit more dated, The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, and The Case for Faith, and The Case for a Creator. 3 books by Lee Strobel. A Case for Christ focuses on the particular issues surrounding the claims of Jesus, such as the reliability of the sources. It talks about Jesus' own view of himself. It talks about evidence for the resurrection. So that's very helpful. Then when in the book, The Case for Faith, he answers at some level, he answers most of the main objections that you're going to hear. He answers the problem of evil. He talks about science and miracles. He talks about genocide, and he makes an argument for the exclusivity of Christianity. He talks about hell. He talks about this history of violence or injustice, some of the things that we've mentioned today. And then in The Case for a Creator, Strobel critiques evolution and he defends creationism from a whole bunch of different angles. So the question of evolution is tied up, of course, intimately with the question of the nature or the existence of God. And then one that's a little also more philosophical is called Defending Your Faith by R.C. Sproul. Sproul, I should say. He interacts with the principles of philosophy, like things like epistemology and causality. He interacts with philosophers like Kant and Hume. And so if you're interested in a sort of a more intellectual, a more heady approach, then you could take a look at Sproul. And then one more I would mention is by Sean McDowell. It's called Apologetics for a New Generation. And this is very accessible for most readers, but it's also, I like it because it's tuned in to the questions and concerns of the younger generations, of the millennials. So it talks about things that are more on their minds, including things like homosexuality, gender issues, and it talks about women's issues as well. And so those are all some great resources. I hope you'll have an opportunity to check some of those out. And so that's our approach to some of the apologetics issues. I hope you can see how apologetics is important. These are some things that we need to study to be ready to give an answer for the hope that we have, to be ready to bolster our evangelism, to make sure that people hear the good news, but to make sure they understand that it's credible, that the message of Christ really does make sense and it is reasonable to believe. And so I'm hoping that you'll have an opportunity to dig in more deeply on some of these things on your own and to study them with more depth. And just want to encourage you then to know some of this stuff, but also to keep your apologetics in the right lane, so that really we're engaging apologetics out of compassion, out of love for people, out of a concern for them as individuals, and not just to answer questions or to win arguments. But because we care about people and their eternal destiny, we care about their lives and what they think. And so you'll have a chance now to discuss some of the things we talked about tonight. I hope you have a great conversation about that.